A little boy makes a wish at a fountain, tossing in his last coin and hoping for his mother's recovery, unaware that a billionaire CEO noticed him from a distance. What the billionaire decides to do next leaves the boy and his mom in shock. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of rain from the night before, as Jack stood in front of the fountain, gripping the small, worn coin in his hand. It was nothing special, just an ordinary penny he had found on the sidewalk a few days ago. But to him, it was everything. It was the only thing he had left to give. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned it over in his palm, staring at the water before him. The fountain was massive, its marble edges smooth and cool, its surface rippling gently under the spray from the stone cherubs perched at the top. Coins of every size and color glittered beneath the water, shimmering under the weak morning sunlight. People had thrown in their wishes, dreams of love, fortune, happiness. Jack had only one. Closing his eyes, he whispered the words under his breath. "Please let my mom get better." His voice was barely audible, but in his heart, he hoped someone, anyone, was listening. Then, with a deep breath, he tossed the coin. It flipped once, twice, then disappeared into the water with a small splash. Jack watched it sink, feeling an ache in his chest. His mother always told him to have hope, that wishes only worked if you believed in them. But belief wasn't enough to make medicine cheaper or doctors more willing to help without insurance. And as much as he wanted to trust in miracles, he knew better than to expect one. From across the square, Richard Cross leaned against a sleek black car, hands in the pockets of his tailored coat, watching. He hadn't meant to stop, he had places to be, meetings lined up, people waiting. He wasn't the type to waste time on street-side sentimentality. But something about the boy had caught his eye. It wasn't just the way he stood there, shoulders stiff, as if he were trying not to cry. It was the way he clutched that single coin like it held the weight of the world, the way he whispered his wish as if his life depended on it. Richard had made his own fair share of wishes in the past, most of them long since buried under the reality of the world. He had learned early that wishes didn't build empires, calculated risks and ruthless decisions did. Yet he found himself stepping forward before he could talk himself out of it. His polished shoes clicked against the stone pavement as he approached the fountain, hands still in his pockets. Jack didn't notice him at first, his gaze still fixed on the water, but when Richard stopped beside him, the boy turned, startled. He was younger than Richard had first guessed, maybe 9 or 10, but there was something about him that made him seem older. Maybe it was the dark circles under his eyes or the way his clothes were a little too thin for the cold. Maybe it was the way he didn't flinch at the presence of a stranger. "You really think that works?" Richard asked, nodding toward the fountain. Jack blinked up at him. "What?" "Wishing," Richard said. "You think tossing in a penny's gonna change anything?" Jack hesitated, glancing back at the water. "I don't know," he admitted. "But it's all I have." Richard studied him for a moment, noting the way his fingers curled into fists at his sides, the stubborn tilt of his chin. "What did you wish for?" Jack hesitated again, as if he wasn't sure he should say. Then, after a long pause, he sighed. "For my mom to get better." Something in Richard's expression flickered, but it was gone before Jack could place it. "She's sick?" Jack nodded. "Yeah. The doctors say it's bad, but—" He cut himself off, swallowing hard. "She's gonna be okay." The words were spoken with conviction, but there was something in the way he said them that made Richard's chest tighten. A familiar kind of desperation. A kind he had once known too well. Richard exhaled, glancing at the fountain again. "Doctors say a lot of things." Jack frowned, as if trying to figure him out. "Do you think it'll work?" he asked. "The wish?" Richard considered lying, but there was no point. "No." Jack's shoulders sagged slightly, but he didn't look surprised. He just turned back to the water, scuffing his shoe against the pavement. "I figured." Richard wasn't sure why he kept standing there. He had already said too much, wasted too much time. But instead of walking away, he found himself asking, "Where's your dad?" Jack's expression darkened. "Gone." Richard arched a brow. "Gone where?" Jack shrugged, shoving his hands into the pockets of his jacket. "Just gone." Richard understood the unspoken words. He had seen the same story play out 100 times in the business world, people running when things got too hard. He had never had a father himself, not really, just a man who left before he was old enough to remember. And standing there, looking at this kid who had more fight in him than some men twice his age, Richard felt something uncomfortable twist in his gut. "Well," he said after a moment, straightening. "Good luck, kid." Jack looked up at him, confused. "That's it? What else do you want?" Richard asked, amused. Jack shrugged. "I don't know. You seemed like you were gonna say something important." Richard smirked. "I'm not really the inspirational speech type." Jack rolled his eyes. "Yeah, I can tell." Richard chuckled, shaking his head. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Jack standing by the fountain. He could feel the boy watching him as he crossed the square, but he didn't look back. The second he rounded the corner, however, his smirk vanished. He pulled his phone from his pocket, pressing a number without hesitation. His assistant picked up on the second ring. "Mr. Cross?" she answered briskly. "Find out everything about a boy named Jack and his mother, Emily," Richard said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Medical records, financials, everything. And do it fast." There was a brief pause before his assistant responded. "Understood." Richard ended the call and slipped his phone back into his coat. He didn't know why he was doing this. It wasn't his problem. He had spent years keeping his distance from things that weren't his responsibility, from people who didn't concern him. But something about that kid, standing there, clutching his last hope between his fingers, had made him pause. Maybe it was because Jack had reminded him of someone. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in years, Richard had felt the urge to grant a wish, even if the boy never knew it was him making it come true. Richard sat in his car, staring at his phone screen as his assistant's email loaded. The details were brief but enough to make his jaw tighten. Emily Carter, 36. Single mother. Diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. No insurance. No family to help. The report continued with the specifics of her condition, but Richard had seen enough. He wasn't a doctor, but he knew what "months left" meant. It meant there was no fixing this. No miracle treatment. No blank check he could sign that would change the outcome. Yet here he was, dialing his assistant again before he could talk himself out of it. "Set up an appointment with the best oncologist in the city," he said the moment she picked up. "And find me an address." It didn't take long for his car to pull up in front of a rundown apartment building on the edge of town. The place was small, the kind of complex where the paint peeled off the walls and the stairwells smelled like damp concrete. It wasn't the worst place Richard had ever seen, but it was far from what anyone would call home. He stepped out, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive coat, feeling out of place before he even knocked on the door. Jack answered. The boy's eyes widened the moment he saw Richard standing there. "You," he said, gaping. "What are you doing here?" Richard smirked slightly at the reaction. "Told you I wasn't the speech-giving type," he said. "But I never said I didn't follow up." Jack still looked confused, but before he could say anything else, a tired voice called from inside. "Jack, who is it?" A woman appeared behind him, thin and pale, her blonde hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. She was beautiful in a quiet, exhausted way, but there was something fragile about her, like she was holding herself together with sheer willpower. Her gaze flickered to Richard, assessing him with sharp eyes despite the weariness in her face. She didn't look surprised to see a stranger at her door. She just looked wary. "Mom, this is..." Jack started, but Richard cut in smoothly. "Richard Cross," he said, offering his hand. Emily didn't take it. "Cross? As in, the Cross Corporation?" Richard nodded, unfazed. "That would be the one." Emily crossed her arms. You want to tell me why the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company is standing on my doorstep? Jack, meanwhile, was practically vibrating with excitement. Mom, he saw me at the fountain. I told him about you, and I think my wish worked. Richard glanced at Jack, something uncomfortable twisting in his chest. He hadn't come here to crush the kid's hope, but this wasn't some fairy tale. There were no magic wishes. Just decisions. And he had made his. Emily, on the other hand, didn't look the least bit charmed by Jack's enthusiasm. If anything, her expression darkened. If you're here out of pity, I'm here because I can help, Richard interrupted. And before you argue, I already made arrangements for you to see one of the best oncologists in the country. First appointment is tomorrow. Emily stiffened. I can't afford that. You don't have to, Richard said simply. There was a long pause. Emily studied him, her exhaustion momentarily replaced with something sharper. Why? She asked, her voice quiet but firm. What do you get out of this? Richard sighed. He had expected this reaction, but it still irritated him. He wasn't used to explaining himself, wasn't used to justifying his actions. But something about the way she looked at him, like he was a threat rather than a savior, made him reconsider his usual approach. Nothing, he said honestly. I don't need anything from you. I just saw your kid making wishes on spare change and figured I could do better than a fountain. Emily let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. So what, you just swoop in, play the hero, and then walk away? That's not how this works. I don't take charity. Richard exhaled, patience thinning. It's not charity. It's a business deal. That made her pause. A deal? You let me pay for the best possible treatment, no questions asked. You don't have to owe me anything. In return, you make sure Jack has more time with his mother, even if it's just a little. Richard kept his voice even. Seems like a fair trade, doesn't it? Emily stared at him for a long moment. Jack, who had been silent during the exchange, suddenly reached for his mother's hand. Mom! Please! Emily's lips pressed together. She was too smart not to understand what Richard was really saying, that he had seen her medical records, that he knew how bad it was. And despite her pride, despite her clear distrust, she also knew what Jack's eyes were begging her to do. Slowly, painfully, she nodded. Fine, she said, voice barely above a whisper. But I'm not moving anywhere. We're staying here. Richard's mouth twitched. We'll see. The next few days moved faster than Emily could argue. Richard had her transported to a private hospital for evaluation. The doctors ran tests, outlined treatments, made plans. Jack barely left her side, practically bouncing off the walls with hope. And when Richard took him out to get food one night, Jack grinned up at him and said, I knew it. I knew my wish would work. Richard forced a smirk. You sure about that? Maybe I'm just a guy who doesn't like unfinished business. Jack shook his head, unbothered by the deflection. Nope. It was the wish. Richard didn't answer. He wasn't one for sentimentality, but even he had to admit there was something different about this. He had thrown money at problems before, had fixed things just because he could. But this wasn't some abstract business venture. It was a boy who believed in miracles and a woman who didn't. And for the first time in a long time, Richard found himself wondering which one of them was right. By the end of the week, Emily and Jack had a new place, whether Emily wanted it or not. Richard had arranged for an apartment closer to the hospital, in a better neighborhood, with enough space for Jack to actually have a real bed and not just a mattress on the floor. When Emily protested, Richard simply shrugged and said, I didn't do this for you. I did it for him. Jack ran through the apartment beaming, declaring it the best place ever. Emily sat stiffly on the new couch, watching Richard like he was some kind of storm she couldn't predict. You don't stop, do you? She murmured. Richard smirked, hands in his pockets. Not when I know I'm right. Jack ran back into the room then, practically bouncing in place. Mom! Look at this! It's got a view! And a real fridge! And Mr. Cross, does this mean we get to stay here? Richard hesitated for only a second before nodding. Yeah, kid. It means exactly that. Jack beamed, looking completely convinced that the universe had finally answered his wish. And for the first time, Richard wasn't so sure it hadn't. The first few weeks felt like a miracle. Emily started treatment, and for the first time in a long time, Jack had hope. She had color in her cheeks again. She laughed more, got out of bed without wincing, even cooked dinner a few nights. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, and Jack clung to every bit of good news as if it were proof that his wish was working. Richard, on the other hand, knew better than to trust the first signs of improvement. He had seen too many deals turn sour just when they seemed solid. He knew how life worked. Hope was a dangerous thing to hold on to. But Jack didn't see any of that. He just saw his mom smiling more. And for a while, Richard let him believe it. Jack had practically made himself at home in Richard's world. Whenever he wasn't at the hospital with Emily, he was trailing after Richard, firing off questions about his job, his car, his watches, anything that fascinated a 10-year-old who had never been around money before. Richard, despite himself, started answering. Started explaining things he never thought he'd bother to say out loud to a kid. One afternoon, Jack sat on the floor of Richard's office, flipping through an old business magazine that had Richard's face on the cover. He wrinkled his nose. "You look weird here," he announced. Richard raised a brow from his desk. "Weird how?" Jack tilted his head, examining the photo like a detective. "I dunno. Too serious. Like you don't ever smile." "Do you ever smile?" Richard smirked. "Do you ever stop talking?" Jack grinned. "Not really." It became a routine, Jack barging into Richard's office when he wasn't at school, plopping down on the expensive leather couch like he owned the place. Richard's employees had learned to tolerate it. His assistant even started keeping juice boxes in the office fridge. Jack took to playing chess on Richard's glass coffee table, though his strategy consisted mostly of moving pieces at random until Richard sighed and taught him the actual rules. "You're thinking too much," Jack said after losing his 5th game in a row. "You gotta loosen up." Richard leaned back in his chair. "That's not really my thing." Jack shrugged. "Then maybe that's why you keep losing at life." Richard narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me?" Jack grinned. "Nothing." Despite himself, Richard started looking forward to their afternoons together. Jack had a way of cutting through the nonsense that people around Richard never dared to. He had no filter, no hesitation. And somewhere along the way, Richard found himself letting his guard down, just a little. It wasn't just office visits either. Richard started taking Jack out, claiming it was just to keep the kid distracted while Emily focused on getting better. But he knew that wasn't entirely true. They went to baseball games, amusement parks, even a ridiculous arcade where Jack made it his mission to beat Richard at every game possible. "You're bad at this," Jack said as Richard lost yet another round of air hockey. "I don't waste time playing games," Richard shot back. "Maybe that's your problem," Jack said, smirking. Richard rolled his eyes but didn't argue. Then there was the infamous spaghetti incident. Jack had somehow convinced Richard to take him to an Italian restaurant, and at some point during dinner, Jack had challenged him to a spaghetti-eating contest, no forks, just pure chaos. Richard had refused at first, but Jack had given him that stubborn look, the same one Emily used when she was trying to win an argument, and Richard had caved. 5 minutes later, Jack was covered in sauce, laughing so hard he could barely breathe. Richard wasn't much better. His assistant had stared at him in horror when he returned to the office later that night, a single strand of spaghetti still stuck to his sleeve. "You look like you lost a bet," she had said dryly. Richard had simply muttered, "Worse. I lost to a 10-year-old. It would have been easy to believe, in those moments, that everything was getting better. That Jack would get to keep his mother. That Richard wouldn't have to worry about what came next. But reality had a way of creeping back in. Emily was getting worse. The signs were small at first: longer naps, A little more weight lost, a little more pain. But then came the bad days. The days where she barely had the strength to talk, where she forced a smile for Jack but Richard could see the truth in her eyes. The doctors started shifting their words, started using phrases like managing discomfort and quality of life. Richard hated those phrases. They were just polite ways of saying, "We're running out of options." Jack, however, refused to see it. He clung to every good moment, to every day where Emily managed to laugh at his jokes. He held on to the idea that if he just believed hard enough, she would make it. His wish had been working so far, hadn't it? Richard didn't have the heart to tell him that wishes only worked in fairy tales. One night, Jack sat in Richard's office, scribbling something in a notebook while Richard worked. "What are you doing?" Richard asked, glancing up from his computer. "Making a list," Jack said. "A list of what?" "Stuff Mom wants to do when she gets better." Richard hesitated, staring at the page. Jack had written things like go to the beach, see a Broadway show, ride in a hot air balloon. Richard swallowed. "Jack!" Jack looked up, eyes bright with hope. "I think we should start with the beach. She always talks about how she loved it when she was a kid. Can we go next weekend?" Richard knew the truth. Knew there might not be a next weekend. But he looked at Jack's face and couldn't bring himself to say no. "Yeah," Richard said quietly. "We'll go." That weekend, Richard rented out an entire section of a private beach. Emily was too weak to do much, but she sat on the sand, watching as Jack ran in and out of the water, laughing. She looked tired, but for the first time in days, she also looked happy. Richard sat beside her, his suit jacket discarded, the cuffs of his dress shirt rolled up. "You didn't have to do this," Emily murmured. Richard kept his eyes on Jack. "I know." She exhaled, a small smile playing at her lips. "You're a strange man, Richard Cross." "So I've been told." Emily chuckled softly, but then her expression grew serious. "Jack thinks his wish is coming true." Richard didn't respond. "You don't have to pretend for me," she said. "I know what's happening. But he still believes, and I don't want to take that from him." Richard finally looked at her. "Neither do I." They sat in silence, listening to the waves crash against the shore. Jack waved at them from the water, his smile wide, his laughter ringing in the air. For that moment, everything felt okay. But Richard knew better than to believe in moments. Because moments, no matter how perfect, never lasted. The beach trip had been perfect in a way that felt almost cruel in hindsight. For one afternoon, they had managed to exist in a world where time didn't matter, where laughter wasn't borrowed, and where the weight of reality didn't press down on their shoulders. Jack had run up and down the shoreline, collecting seashells, making Emily promise they'd come back when she was stronger. She had smiled, agreed, even though both she and Richard knew better. Back in the apartment, the decline came quickly. The bad days outnumbered the good ones, and soon, the good days disappeared entirely. Emily became too weak to walk on her own. The simplest tasks exhausted her. She tried to keep up a brave face for Jack, but the boy wasn't stupid. He saw it. He felt it. He just didn't want to believe it. Richard was at the hospital late one night when Emily asked to speak with him alone. Jack had fallen asleep in the chair beside her bed, his small hand curled around hers, his breathing deep and even. Richard stepped into a hallway with her, unsure of what she was about to say but already knowing he wasn't going to like it. Her voice was quieter than usual, her strength barely enough to hold a whisper. "Richard, I need you to listen to me." He didn't respond right away, just shoved his hands into his pockets. "I'm listening." She smiled faintly, like she saw through his attempt at indifference. "I don't have much time left. We both know that." Richard's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. She exhaled, slow and measured. "Jack needs someone. When I'm gone, he's going to need." Her voice broke slightly, and she looked away, composing herself before continuing. "He's going to need family." Richard forced himself to hold her gaze, even though he wanted to look anywhere else. "He has a father." her lips pressed into a tight line. You and I both know that doesn't mean anything. He did know. Jack's father had left years ago, unable to handle the responsibility of a sick wife and a child. Emily had never spoken about him much, and Richard hadn't asked, but the absence had been loud enough to be understood. She reached for his hand, surprising him. Her fingers were thin, frail, barely holding warmth. Richard, you and Jack? He looks up to you. He trusts you. And I see the way you look after him. She swallowed hard. Promise me. When I'm gone, don't let him be alone. Richard had closed 100 business deals, negotiated with the most ruthless men in the world, but somehow, this was the hardest deal he had ever been asked to make. He swallowed. Emily, You don't have to say yes right now. She interrupted, though her eyes pleaded with him. Just think about it. But he already knew the answer. The night she passed, it was peaceful. Richard was at the hospital when the doctors told him, but Jack had been at the apartment, asleep in his room. Richard sat by Emily's bedside for a long time, staring at the woman who had fought so damn hard. She had been brave, even when she didn't have to be. Even when she knew it was a losing battle. The nurses spoke in hushed voices, asked Richard if there was anyone else to notify. There wasn't. That night, Richard drove back to the apartment with a weight in his chest heavier than anything he had ever carried. Jack was waiting for him, already awake, sitting at the kitchen table, his small hands gripping the edges as if bracing for impact. Richard didn't have to say anything. Jack looked up, and something in his face crumbled. No, he whispered. No, she was getting better. Richard sat across from him, unsure of what to do, how to ease the blow of something that could never be softened. Jack, you said we were going back to the beach. Jack's voice cracked, his breath coming in shallow bursts. You promised. She promised. His hands balled into fists. I made a wish. Richard's chest tightened. I know. Then why didn't it work? Jack's voice broke entirely, his shoulders shaking. Why didn't it work, Mr. Cross? Richard had no answer for him. Jack refused to leave his room the next day. He wouldn't eat, wouldn't talk. He just lay curled under his blanket, clutching one of his mom's sweaters, as if he could hold on to her that way. Richard had never felt so useless in his life. He had built an empire from nothing, had pulled himself out of the darkest moments with nothing but sheer will, but none of that mattered here. Jack wasn't a business deal to fix. He was a grieving child who had lost his entire world, and no amount of money or logic could fix that. Richard tried in his own way. He ordered food, knowing Jack liked cheeseburgers but barely touching his own when the kid didn't even glance at the plate. He tried to check in, tried to talk, but Jack only turned away. 3 days passed like that. Silence. On the 4th day, Richard walked into Jack's room, sat at the edge of the bed, and said, I lost my parents when I was your age. Jack didn't move at first, but after a long moment, he turned his head slightly, just enough to look at Richard. Richard exhaled. I didn't have anyone after that. No one to talk to. No one to take care of me. I had to figure it out on my own. He rested his elbows on his knees. I don't want that for you, Jack. Jack's lip trembled, but he clenched his jaw. Then why does it feel like I'm alone? Richard had no good answer for that either. But he reached out, ruffled the boy's hair in a way that felt unfamiliar, but right. You're not. Not anymore. Jack didn't respond. But later that night, when Richard passed by the boy's room, he found the door slightly open and Jack curled under his blanket, but this time, he wasn't hiding. And Richard, for the first time in a long time, felt something shift inside him. Like maybe, just maybe, he had already made his decision. Richard had dealt with some of the most ruthless men in the world, corporate sharks who would smile in his face while sharpening their knives behind his back. He had sat through brutal negotiations, built an empire with his own 2 hands, and crushed more competitors than he could count. And yet, none of that compared to the rage curling in his chest when Jack's father walked through the door. It had been a few days since Emily's funeral, and Jack had barely spoken a word. He moved through the motions like a ghost, eating only when Richard practically forced him to, sleeping with his mother's sweater clutched in his arms. Richard had given him space, unsure how to help, but refusing to leave him alone in his grief. Then the call came. A social worker had tracked down Jack's biological father, Eric Carter. A man who had walked out years ago when Emily first got sick, leaving her to raise their son alone. And now, suddenly, he was here. Standing in the doorway of the apartment Richard had bought for Emily and Jack, acting as if he had a right to be. Jack stood frozen at the sight of him. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his entire body rigid. Richard wasn't sure what he expected, maybe anger, maybe tears, maybe Jack rushing forward with questions. Instead, the boy just stared. Silent. Eric looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight like he didn't know what to say. He looked rougher than Richard had imagined, his shirt wrinkled, his hair thinning, his eyes darting around as if he was looking for an exit. A man who didn't want to be here, but felt like he had to be. "Hey, kid," Eric said, forcing a smile. "Been a long time, huh?" Jack's fingers twitched, but he said nothing. Eric sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I'm real sorry about your mom. I heard she fought hard." Richard clenched his jaw. "You don't get to talk about her." Eric shifted again, finally looking at Richard. So, I got a call saying I needed to come sort this out. About Jack." Richard didn't move from where he stood, arms crossed, voice steady. "And?" Eric exhaled, glancing down at Jack again. Look, I don't got much right now. I barely make ends meet as it is. I don't think I can take him in." Silence. Jack didn't move, didn't react, but Richard saw the way his shoulders tightened. Like he had already expected this. Like he had already told himself not to hope. Richard's voice was ice. "Then why the hell did you bother coming here?" Eric had the nerve to look uncomfortable. "I just thought I should show up. Say something. I mean, I'm still his, don't..." Richard cut him off sharply. "Don't you dare say you're his father." Eric flinched at the venom in his voice. Jack still didn't move. Still didn't speak. Just stood there, staring at the floor like this wasn't happening at all. Richard stepped forward, his presence towering over Eric. "You had 10 years to be his father. You had 10 years to step up. And now, after his mother dies, you decide to show your face just to tell him you can't? You don't get points for that, Carter." Eric swallowed hard. "I never said it was easy." Richard didn't let him finish. "You're going to turn around. You're going to walk out that door. And you're never going to come back." Eric hesitated for half a second, but the steel in Richard's expression must have convinced him, because he sighed and nodded. He looked at Jack one last time, but the boy still wouldn't meet his eyes. And just like that, he left. Richard exhaled, turning back to Jack, unsure of what to say. But before he could speak, Jack lifted his head, his voice hollow. "I told you I was alone." The words hit Richard like a punch to the ribs. Jack turned and walked into his room, shutting the door behind him. For the rest of the night, Richard sat in the living room, staring at the ceiling, his mind churning. He had never felt like this before, this strange, protective rage, this bone-deep need to make sure that kid never felt unwanted again. But what the hell was he supposed to do? Richard wasn't a parent. He didn't know how to raise a child. He didn't know how to comfort someone through grief, how to be the person Jack needed right now. He wasn't soft. He wasn't gentle. He had built his life around efficiency, not emotions. But when the sun started to rise, the decision had already been made. He wasn't sending Jack to foster care. The next morning, he knocked on Jack's door. The boy didn't answer at first, but after a long pause, he opened it just a crack. His face was blank, but his eyes were tired. Richard didn't waste time. "Pack your stuff." Jack frowned. "Why?" "Because you're coming home with me." Jack blinked, confused. "Home?" Richard nodded. "Yeah. My place. You're not going into the system. You're not staying here alone." Jack hesitated. But why? Richard didn't have a good answer. So he just sighed. Because someone has to take care of you, and I guess that someone is me. Jack studied him, searching his face for something. Then, slowly, he stepped back inside and started packing. Bringing Jack home felt surreal. The kid barely spoke on the ride there, his small hands folded in his lap, his gaze distant. When they pulled up to Richard's house, a massive, sprawling estate that felt way too big for just one person, Jack just stared. You live here? He asked. Yeah, Richard said. Guess you do now, too. Jack's lips pressed together. He didn't look happy. He didn't look excited. He just nodded. Richard watched him for a moment, then sighed. Listen, kid. I don't know what I'm doing, all right? I don't have a clue how to raise a 10-year-old. But I know one thing, you're not alone anymore. Jack looked up, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he stepped out of the car and walked toward the house. Richard followed, knowing that this was only the beginning. Richard had anticipated challenges. He knew Jack wouldn't just settle in and accept this new reality overnight. He wasn't naive enough to think that moving a grieving 10-year-old into a billionaire's mansion would somehow make everything okay. What he hadn't anticipated, however, was just how much of a fight Jack was willing to put up. The silent treatment started first. Jack didn't talk unless absolutely necessary. When Richard asked if he wanted breakfast, Jack shrugged. When he asked if he wanted to watch TV, another shrug. When Richard brought home a bag of groceries filled with kid-friendly snacks, Jack glanced at it, then walked away without a word. It was like living with a ghost. A very small, very stubborn ghost. Then came the attitude. Richard had once been described as the most intimidating man in the boardroom, but Jack had him beat. The kid could throw a glare that could melt steel. When Richard tried to set ground rules, Jack pushed back in the only ways he could, ignoring him, refusing to eat dinner, slamming doors just hard enough to make a point without breaking anything. It wasn't anger, not really. It was grief in its rawest form, a kid trying to regain some control over a world that had ripped everything away from him. Richard tried to be patient. He really did. But patience had never been his strong suit, and Jack seemed determined to test what little he had. The first real disaster struck when Richard attempted to cook breakfast. He was a man who had